Heads up! I mean, literally, heads up. That's the topic of discussion on today's Tavern Poker Podcast. I'm Steve Wannall, your poker guru, and let's daydream a little bit, shall we? I know some people might consider daydreaming to be a pointless or foolish pastime, but I respectfully disagree. I believe that no goal worth achieving ever became a reality if you didn't daydream about it first. And if you did achieve your goals without fantasizing about it, well, maybe you should ask yourself if it was really all that important in the first place. But I digress. I am not a motivational speaker. I am here to facilitate a poker discussion. And of course for the daydream. Let's not forget about that. Okay, so here it is. Let's assume you are in a really big tournament. Now, of course, it could be anything that you want, but for the sake of argument, let's say it's a satellite. There's something big on the line. Maybe you've been playing in low-stakes games for a long time. Maybe not. Maybe you've been here before. But this is something that's really big. It's really important to you. Let's say it's a World Series seed even, like the main event. This is for a $10,000 package. And perhaps you put up a little bit of money to get into this tournament to try and qualify for a cheap seat. Something that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to afford. Maybe you even got here from a super satellite and you don't have any money on the line at all, so this is a really big chance to turn nothing into something. But the point is, it's a big deal. People are taking this a lot more seriously than your usual casual game. And now let's also assume that you've been doing really, really well. You've had a good tournament so far. You've been in this thing for hours. You've outlasted most of the field. Now, I'm a firm believer that nobody goes deep in a tournament without a number of certain and specific things happening. So, for example, you've probably sucked out a few times. You've almost certainly had a really good run of cards at least once or twice. Maybe you pulled off a couple of really good bluffs. Maybe you had some value bets that got paid off in a great way. Maybe you busted a couple of people out. You probably made one or two really tough laydowns and a couple of great hero calls. But however it happened, you got there. You're now at the final table, and there's just a few people left. And after battling in some of the most intense competition that you've seen so far, and people get knocked out left and right, suddenly you look up and you realize that there's just two of you left sitting at the table. There is only one person standing between you and total victory. That means it is now time for heads-up play. And it also means that the entire tournament is about to change. For those people who are lucky enough to make it all the way to heads-up play in a big tournament, one of the first things you'll notice is that it is a completely different animal. For one thing, the action is a whole lot faster, even more so than when there were 3 or 4 of you left. Where before you could take your time and wait for some of the better hands to show up, you no longer have that luxury. Suddenly you're playing every single hand. And you'll very quickly realize that you can't afford to wait around for the good hands anymore. You have to suddenly get creative. You're almost forced to play every single hand that gets dealt to you. And you might also notice that the more passively you play your hands, the more likely your opponent is to take advantage of that and start taking pot after pot after pot from you. If aggression was important before, it's twice as important now. If position was important before, it's 4 times more important now. The stakes have just become super heightened. But it's not all bad news, because there's also less to concentrate on. Where before you might have to pay attention to an entire table, where you have to pay attention to the size of the chip stacks to your left, or how many people are being aggressive in front of you, or whether or not you've got a read on the person sitting across the table from you, now there's just one person that you have to deal with. There's just one other chip stack, there's just one other style of play. As a result, the game is a lot more hyper-focused. So how do you handle being in this situation? How do you do heads-up play? What's the best strategy to employ? How do you figure it out? How do you make sure that by the end of this thing, you're the one standing alone at the table with all of the chips? Well, it's not just cut and dry. And it's not just a matter of pure chance or luck of the draw, or whether or not you get good cards or not, or whether you have the bigger chip stack going in. All of these things are factors, of course. But there's a lot more to it than that. Now, as with most other poker lessons, for myself, this is something that I discovered I had to learn the hard way. I was pretty comfortable with how I was playing my game for a long time, and I had been to heads-up play many, many times, but there was one particular season of tournaments where I noticed an interesting thing that happened. It was a 26-week Tavern season where I just so happened to be tracking my own scores and my own performances myself, not just looking at the things that they automatically tracked for you on the website. So I was paying attention to a lot more than how many times I won the game, or how many times I came in the top 3, or even just how many tournaments I played in altogether. I was tracking a lot of different things. I kept my own spreadsheet. I kept track of things like how many people played in whatever tournament I was in, and exactly what place I ended up in. I even did things like create a virtual buy-in for these free tournaments that I had been playing in, so I could determine over the course of an entire season what my real money investment would have been had I been playing in all of these tournaments for money, and how much money I would have earned every time I effectively cashed out. Well, overall, what I discovered was that I had done amazingly well. I had actually placed high in a great many of the tournaments that I'd played in, and if they had been real money tournaments, I actually would have turned a rather substantially high profit, so I was really pleased. But I also noticed something very interesting. I had an inordinately high number of second-place finishes. Now, the good news there, of course, is if you're consistently coming in second place, you're going to be doing really, really well. You're probably going to be operating in the black if you're strictly a tournament player, and you're always coming in second place. It's frustrating, to be sure, but you're going to make a whole lot of money. I remember a good number of years ago in the world of golf, for example, there was a player by the name of Greg Norman, a very famous pro player, and at the time, he had never won a major tournament. He'd never won the Masters, he'd never won the US Open, anything like that, but he was also the richest golf player on the circuit. No one had won more money in the game of golf than he had, and it is because he came in second place over and over and over again. But I'm sure if you asked him, how he felt he was doing in the game of golf, he probably would have answered, well, something's going wrong because I can't seem to win one of these things. I don't really know what his philosophy on that was. I'm sure he wasn't having that difficult a time, really, because the man was a multimillionaire. But he had a number of second-place finishes, and that was enough to make him very, very rich. The same can be true in poker. I happen to live in the great state of Maryland, and there are a lot of very high-profile poker players from Maryland who have done really, really well in big poker tournaments, and notably a lot of them have come in second place in some pretty big tournaments. Steve Denneman and Darvin Moon come to mind. These are both players who came in second place in the main event of the World Series of Poker. It was a big deal for Marylanders when Greg Merson finally managed to win one and not come in second place. And my big daydream was always, I'm looking forward to being the next big player from Maryland to finish second in the main event of the World Series. But noticing that I had come in second place so many times, that I had such an incredible string of second place finishes in one season, was a big red flag. It really opened my eyes to a hole in my game that I didn't even realize I had had. Now, obviously, I had felt the frustration of getting to heads up so many times and never actually winning. I believe I had won a few times, but it wasn't nearly as much as it could have been. I believe over the course of the season, I had played something in the neighborhood of 50 or 60 games, and I had 5 wins, but if I had won every single time I had been to heads up, I would have had 11 or 12 wins on the season. That's a pretty substantial difference. And it told me that perhaps I was doing something wrong, or not doing enough. There was some kind of roadblock that I hit every time it got down to one-on-one play. So I started working on it. I really started studying it. I started almost exclusively focusing on that aspect of my game. Because I knew I was pretty solid a player. I knew I was good enough to get to heads up. I was able to do that very, very consistently. I was very good at measuring out my play over the course of a tournament that lasted several hours. So that wasn't a problem. I knew that I could be tight aggressive early on. I knew how to punish the mid-range stacks when you got close to bubbles. I knew how to maximize value out of my good hands. I had a lot of solid tournament strategy down, but heads up was something that for some reason I just couldn't grasp. So I really started paying attention to it, and I learned a few things, and I started employing a few things, and it really made a big difference. And here are some of the things that I figured out. Now, of course, if you Google heads up strategy, heads up poker strategy, You're going to find a lot of these ideas as well that are out there. And a lot of the pros will tell you, yeah, this is how you should do things. Obviously, I don't believe there is a right or wrong way to do anything, but certain things I think are really, really important to just make a regular part of your game. And then that way you can know when you should be deviating from some of these things in order to adjust to the situation. Now, one of the first things I personally changed was just reminding myself not to go on autopilot. If you've been playing in a long tournament and whatever you've been doing has been going really, really well for you, then it's really hard to give yourself a reason to change that when you get to heads-up play. It's really easy to stay in that zone and not change your strategy at all. You kind of get in this quiet mindset of, well, why should I change something when nothing's broken? Why should I fix something that isn't broken? But the problem with that is that the game has already changed. It has changed whether you've decided to change or not. Because there's a lot of things that are different. With just two people, your opponent is definitely going to be focused on you. There's no one else they have to worry about. And of course, there's no one else that you have to worry about. But you're also playing way more hands in the same space of time. If you're at a table of 10 people, then you're going to get maybe 1 or 2 hands in every now and then. Heads up, you're playing every single hand. And that led me to the next thing that I really noticed, which is that you have to change your hand range. Now, I think a lot of players, when they first start out in this game, they tend to do one of two different things. They will either play as many hands as humanly possible because they want to get involved, they want to play, they want to gamble, or they'll play very, very few hands. They will just wait for the really, really good stuff to come along. And often you don't see a whole lot of in between. You don't see people really mixing up their play a whole lot when they're rank amateurs. They'll just focus on one of those two different things, one of those two different styles. But there's a problem with both of those strategies in the sense that you're not necessarily controlling the action. You're letting the action control you. In one sense, you're just playing any hand, and you're waiting for it to hit something good, and then you'll play. In the other sense, you're waiting for the good hand to show up, and, you're just getting rid of everything else. But you're kind of leaving it to the luck of the draw in both cases. You can't do that heads up. You can, but it's not going to give you that edge. It's not going to give you the push that you need to make sure that you're the one winning. The best thing you can do is try and actively control your fate, and heads up is the best opportunity to do that. So how do you do that? Well, aggression. Now, you're going to hear the word aggression kicked around like a football in every single poker discussion, because it is hugely important, but it's really, really, really important heads up. The reason for that is that you have to be the one who's putting your opponents on the hard decisions. You really want to have the betting lead as much as you possibly can. Now, obviously, if you're pushing every single hand, your opponent's going to figure out how to exploit that you're doing that. And, sometimes you're not even going to get the chance. Maybe your opponent is the one who does that. Maybe they're the ones who started right off the bat. They were the ones who got to the aggressive attitude first. And then you've been put in a position of just reacting to that. So there's a lot of factors that you have to take into consideration when deciding exactly how aggressive or reactive you're going to be in heads-up play. A big one is the size of your chip stack. Oftentimes, there's going to be a pretty big discrepancy between the two players going heads up. Maybe one person just knocked 3 people out in a row, and that's how you got to heads up, and you're going in at a pretty big disadvantage. Sometimes you're close to even, but someone's always ahead. There's always going to be a situation where one person can knock out the other person. And when the chip stacks are close to even, then it's really important to make sure that you're not overcommitting yourself, that you're controlling the pot size. Unless, of course, that you feel that you have the best chance to win and your opponent is also in a position where they're not going to fold, or they're going to pay you off if you make value bets. But being aggressive puts you in the best position to do that. And let me give you an example. One of the first times I got heads up in a specific venue that I was playing in was against a player who was not only number 1 in the venue that I was playing, but they were number 1 in the nation. Or maybe they weren't number 1 in the nation, but they were really high. This was a player who consistently showed up high in the national rankings. I've never been that player because I don't play that much. In Tavern leagues, in order to make the really high rankings, because you're just playing for points in a Tavern league. You're not playing for money until you get to the bigger events that you qualify for. But in order to make those big points, in order to make the national rankings, you have to play all the time. You have to play 7 days a week, 2 tournaments a day at least. I know some people who, just out of a matter of point of pride, they try and get in even more than that. They'll bust out early in one tournament and they'll hop in the car and they'll drive as fast as they can to the next tournament to try and get into the next game and see what they can do there. Personally, I find that to be a little bit mad for free poker, but, whatever, float your boat. But in any case, this person was one of those people who was really, really high up in the rankings and was used to winning. She'd been to Heads Up many, many times, and I was no slouch either, but I had never been Heads Up against her. And this was a venue that she was running, so suddenly here we were. It was a long tournament. Longer than the usual one, in fact. I think she had a great number of players in this tournament. But it came down to just the two of us, and I was in the middle of my heads-up restructuring phase. So this is one of the first opportunities that I'd had to really put my new philosophy of heads-up play to the test and change what I was doing. So immediately, I switched gears upon going to heads-up. Now, what I had been doing the entire tournament at this point was playing it very, very tight aggressive. I had a very squeaky clean table image as someone who wasn't going to get involved unless I had a good hand, and while I was always aggressive with those good hands, I had never shown down a loser. Even in those instances where I wound up losing the hand, I always was able to table something that showed them, oh yeah, I had the best one going in, or it was at least very, very strong. So people knew that if I was raising or being aggressive, I very likely had a very strong hand. Now, when I got to heads up, I knew that those hands just aren't going to come along very often. The truth of it is, strong hands don't come along very often anyway, but when you're heads up, and you're playing every single hand, what you're going to notice is that those strong hands seem to be so few and far between. And it's no different. But the difference is when you're playing every single hand, you've got to get so creative. So I took the stance of just raising a lot. I didn't want to just limp in. I'd seen that happen so many times in so many low-stakes heads-up scenarios where people wouldn't change. They would just get dealt their 2 cards. The dealer button, who is also the small blind, would just call the big blind. The big blind would check their option. They'd go to a flop. If somebody hit, they'd bet. If the other person hadn't hit, they'd fold. But often they would both just check it down all the way to the river and then turn their cards over and see who won. That to me wasn't very interesting poker. It wasn't really poker at all. It was just kind of playing cards. It was letting the cards do all the talking for you. And I see that over and over and over again. Well, I wasn't interested in doing that. I wanted to do something proactive to win the tournament, so I decided I was going to start building pots and trying to get the betting lead. I wanted to be the aggressor going in, so I started raising every single hand. Now, luckily, my opponent in this case was someone who was fairly easy to read. She was very, very tight aggressive in the sense that if she didn't have it, she'd fold. If she did have it, she'd push all in. There wasn't a whole lot of gray area there. Not a whole lot of mixing it up in her play. There wasn't a whole lot of measured value betting. I'd never seen her min-raise in my entire time playing with her. She always had 2 gears, stop and go. And that became something I could really exploit. Now, often, I would raise pre-flop, she would look at her hand, she'd fold. We'd go on to the next hand. Maybe she'd limp in. I would raise, she would fold. Then we'd do it all over again. Then maybe she would limp in and I would raise and it wouldn't be that much, so she'd call to see a flop, but then I would bet again and she'd fold because she hadn't hit anything. And I realized that simply by doing this, by making small bets, this was like classic small ball poker, I was able to take down pot after pot after pot. Now, there is a danger with doing that. If you're being so aggressive that you're taking every single pot and suddenly your opponent comes in for a big bet and they take it away from you, well, you have to be careful. You have to make the bet sizing right, because if you're playing big raises and your opponent's just folding and folding and folding, and then you make a big raise and suddenly they go all in and they take all of these chips back, well, you have to make sure you're betting in such a way that you're not just going to lose all those small pots in the one pot that they win. So there's a little bit more strategy to it. There's a little more being careful about how you're doing the bets. It doesn't take much. It was really just a matter of trying to build up the pot a little bit so that when I would win pots, it was more than just the blinds. And it was also ensuring that I had the betting lead going in, which suggested that I felt more comfortable about my hand. And this is really important when you're in position as well. If you're on the button, if you're last to act after the flop, it's really important to have the betting lead there, to be able to see what your opponent is doing first. And remember, this is just heads up. You don't have to worry about anybody else at the table. You can put all your focus on them and see how they react. So it's easier to get a read on them. It's easier to figure out if they have something first before you commit to an action. And since most flops miss most hands, it's going to be easier to take it down without a fight. Well, in this particular case, because I had such a tight table image, and this was a player who, while she had done very, very well for herself in this league, she wasn't really used to adjusting to somebody who was playing different than the usual tavern play. She was used to the kind of thing where she was the aggressor, where they would limp in to see flops and then whoever won. But I wasn't doing that. And she did a lot of folding to me, and before long she did a lot of complaining as well, in the sense of, I can't believe you have it every single time. One of these times you're not going to have a hand. Well, what she didn't understand was that I almost never had a hand. Not a really good one. I mean, I wasn't doing this with pocket aces or ace king or king queen even. I was doing it with every 2 cards I'd been dealt. And every now and then I would put in my little raise, she would shove all in, and I would immediately get away from it cheap. And I knew that the more I did that, the more her chip stack would whittle down a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And then when she finally did wake up with a hand, hopefully I would either have a really strong hand or it wouldn't matter because her chip stack wouldn't have been big enough at that point to really damage me if I called and lost. I wound up winning that tournament, and it was a turning point for me. I realized, boy, this was a whole lot easier if I adjusted my play. And that's another thing that's hard to do when you're heads up, and that's something that's really, really important. Now, my big philosophy of poker is that you should always be adjusting to the situation. You can't just stay in one lane. You can't just stick to one strategy or one style of play. You always have to adjust to the circumstances, to the players at the table, to the metagame, meaning the tournament at large. To every little thing that happens, you have to be able to change what you're doing based on all the new information that you have. Well, in heads up, that's every moment. And sometimes those changes are going to be massive swings in how you play the game. And the reason that's so important heads up is because you really want to avoid being predictable. That's something that's important in general. You don't want to become predictable at the table because you don't want to give people a strategy that they can build to use against you because they figured out how you're playing the game. So you don't want to be predictable in any sense. But in heads up, you can't fall into a pattern. That means when you do get those good hands, you have to mix up how you play them. Now, if you've just raised hand after hand after hand, and suddenly you pick up a really strong hand in the hole, well, now you have to really consider how you're going to play them. You might just want to go on autopilot and say, oh, well, I got a strong hand I need to raise here. But you also have to consider what just happened in the past few hands that you raised. Did you chase them off every time? Did they just call so they could see a flop? If you're raising here, are you betting for value or are you just flirting with taking down the blinds again? Sometimes, often, in fact, heads up, you're just going to limp in with your stronger hands because the reason your hands are stronger is that statistically they're more likely to win. And if you know you're only up against one opponent, then that hand is even more likely to hold up on its own merits, and you don't want to chase away your action. Those are the times when you want to try and build a pot. You want to try and string your opponent along, even if you haven't hit anything, because statistically speaking, you're more likely to get there. But again, you have to be reading your opponent. You have to be reading the situation. So you want to be more aggressive. You want to pay more attention to position. You don't want to be predictable. You have to blow your hand range wide open. You have to be prepared to play just about anything. Well, and here's another great way to adjust in that particular situation. It's really important to try and control your table image as well. If you've gone to heads up with a tight, aggressive table image, someone who's never shown down anything but winners, then this is a great opportunity to try and reinforce that. Because if you're going to be playing more hands and you want to get credit for having strong hands every time you raise, then a great thing to do every now and then is when you have a really, really terrible hand when you're in the small blind, don't even play it. Give them a walk. Seriously, just fold it face up on the table and say, hey, you can have this one. That might seem like a really simple, subtle gesture, but it can sit in their head as well. It reinforces your image to them. It tells them they're not going to play if they don't have a hand. And then if you go back to raising a little more often, they're going to have it reinforced in their head that, this is a person who's playing the good stuff. Now, of course, the opposite can be true as well. Maybe you've gone to heads up and you have a very different table image. Maybe you've been hyper-aggressive the whole time. I'm not just advocating my own personal style of play. There's a lot of different ways to play this game, and I have to concede that I don't know everything about it, of course. I'm just an amateur like anybody else, and some people have a very different style of play that works just fine for them. And maybe you're hyper-aggressive. Maybe you've got a very loose table image. Well, this might be an opportunity to even change that up a little bit. Maybe you slow it down and you start trying to outplay them on later streets. Maybe you don't get aggressive until the turn or the river. Now that, of course, requires paying really close attention to how they're doing and figuring out what their hand range is and whether or not they're likely to have hit the flop or whether they're likely to call you or not. But the point I'm making is you have to adjust. Adjust, adjust, adjust. Constantly mix it up. I think it's also important to really pay attention to the playability of certain kinds of hands. Most people will understand that high paired cards and high suited connectors are pretty good. They'll understand that maybe mid-range suited connectors are pretty decent. Even some of the lower suited connectors can be pretty good. They'll know things like 7-deuce offsuit is terrible, but you really need to pay attention to how certain hands play in certain situations. For example, heads up. Let's say you've got a pretty bad hand, but you saw a free flop with it because you're in the big blind and the person on the button just limped in, so you're seeing a free flop. Let's say you have, 3-6 offsuit, something like that. And the flop, of course, is not going to be great for you in most of those situations, but let's say you paired your 3. The smallest card on the board is a 3, and that paired the smallest card in your hand. Well, that might not seem like much. That might seem like a hand that you're just going to want to try and play out and hopefully get to a river cheap and maybe it's going to be the winner. But consider this. A pair of 3s at that stage of the tournament, heads up, could very well be very ahead of your opponent at that point. You might be in a very strong position. Even if they've got overcards, it's going to be hard for them to hit. If they haven't already made a pair, they've only got 2 cards to come. You may very well have the best hand right now. And while you don't necessarily want more action, if that's true, and all you have is a pair of 3s, it really behooves you to try and either take it down right now or set yourself up to try and win on a later street with more money. Maybe they've got some kind of a draw. Maybe they just don't want to let go of their overcards. Maybe you're up against King-Queen, and they don't want to let it go. Well, this is a time to bet for value. So your hand ranges, they're going to seem a lot weaker. Everything you do is going to seem a whole lot weaker. The pairs you make, they're going to seem like they're not very strong. The opening hands you get are going to seem like they're not very strong. But they could very well be ahead. Maybe you just have to convince yourself that you're bluffing with the best hand when you make some of these bets, and that's fine. If you need to treat it like a bluff, do so. But also, you need to bluff. You need to do a lot more bluffing. Now, I know in an earlier episode I mentioned that bluffing is something that you want to use sparingly. It's just one tool in the toolbox that you need to break out, and you need to wait for the right opportunities. That's still true in heads up. But in heads up, you need to do a lot more bluffing than you would at a table full of people. Often you are going to be bluffing with the best hand. But often, it's not about the hand so much at all. Heads up is really more a battle of will. It's a battle of psychology. It's a battle of who can show more aggressive, who can hang on to the betting lead, who can use position better, who can get better reads on their opponents. And it takes bravery. It really does, especially if you're the kind of person who isn't used to being a heavy aggressor, or if you've got a really tight table image and you're only aggressive when you have the really strong hands, because you know that with a table full of people, anybody could wake up with a hand or just catch good cards and crack your strong hand. So in Heads Up, you have to retrain your brain. You really just have to be brave and go for it. But you got to read the room, too. You have to pay attention to what's going on. Luckily, the room is one person. That's the only person you have to try and get a read on. And maybe they're a really good player. Maybe you're going to have to get lucky. But it can happen. Some of my proudest moments at the poker table came when I went to Heads Up play with a huge chip deficit. One of my favorite tournaments I ever actually ended up winning was one where I went to Heads Up play easily an 11 or 12 to 1 underdog. I mean, this person had a mountain of chips in front of them, and I had something like 3.5 blinds because I'd just taken a bad hit a couple of hands before and lost most of my stack, and then the third player went out and we wound up heads up. And I looked down at my tiny little stack of chips and at the mountain that this guy was sitting across from. And I just kind of jokingly looked at him and said, "Oh, you're going down." And amazingly, he was. He did go down. But here's why. First, of course, I had to get lucky. With 3.5 big blinds, there's not so much you can do to employ a lot of skill. Unless you consider that you can't just go away and wait for a good hand. It's just not going to happen. You just got to take your chances and get it in there and hope to hit. Well, I did. One hand. I doubled up. But then the moment I doubled up, I realized I had an opportunity here. Because once again, I had table image where this guy had seen me show down winners. On the next hand, I had a marginal hand, but I shoved all in with it, and I actually got him to fold. So I'd just taken another blind. From that point on, I was a little bit more aggressive. I had a wide open hand range. I slowly took tiny pot after tiny pot after tiny pot. And then, when I finally woke up with a decent hand, and I actually managed to win a decent pot that he was interested in playing, the next thing you know, we were even in chips. Very shortly after that, I had a slight chip lead. And that's when the aggression really came out. From that point on, there was no turning back. I whittled him down and down and down, and finally he just didn't stand a chance. Now, if this were a game about just gambling, about pure luck, then the law of averages state that he should have been able to do exactly the same thing. And of course he could have, if everything had gone his way, or if he'd altered his play a little bit and maybe done what I had done, whatever. He could have built it back up, but he didn't. And I felt very, very confident in how I was playing, because in that particular case, I was adjusting my play, and he really kind of wasn't. Now, there have been other scenarios where it didn't work out so well for me. I remember I was in a big tournament in Vegas. It was a very notable tournament in that the very first hand I was dealt, I had pocket aces, and I got in a raise war with somebody pre-flop, and he went all in, and I made a crying call. It's like, I really hate getting it all in early in a tournament, especially the first hand, even with pocket aces. Obviously, I'm not folding there, but anything can happen. And this guy, as it turns out, just way overplayed pocket kings, and he was not reading what I was doing. And, I was trying to make sure that I didn't get it all in there, but he was the one who made the move, so I called him and I busted him out in the first hand. So I effectively started that tournament with twice the chip stack of everyone else, and I put it to good use. I was there for the next 7.5 hours, and soon I found myself in heads-up play, and I had the chip lead. It wasn't an enormous chip lead. It was better than 2 to 1. And we were all still kind of reeling from having just gotten there. And we were all really happy. And the staff from the casino even brought out a big, huge rack of chips and sat it on the table, just like they do at the big tournaments where they pour all the money out. And they made a big show out of it. They sat the chips there and they said, "This is what you're playing for." And we were all really happy. And then suddenly my opponent looked down at his cards and went, "I'm all in." And now the very first hand, heads up, he had immediately thrown down the gauntlet and told me what he was going to be doing. And it was really fantastic, actually, because this was a really quiet, passive, older guy who, he just looked like a retiree, who was very unassuming, and he hadn't been tremendously aggressive throughout the entire tournament. He was a very even keel kind of player who had been very careful about how he played. He was able to maximize some of his good hands. He'd gotten some lucky turns of cards as well. But all of a sudden, we're in the first hand, heads up, and he shoves all in. Now, there was no reason to do this. Neither one of us was short-stacked. I had more than he did. But, I mean, the amount of chips that he put into the center of that pot was easily more than just a few big blinds. It was enough that he could have played for a good long while, but he shoved all in heads up on the very first hand. And I looked down at my hand and I had pocket fours. Now, what do you do in that scenario? Well, if I'm the one with pocket fours and I'm first to act, then obviously I'm going to show a lot of aggression there. And I'm going to try and put the decision on him. And if I make a big enough bet and he decides to come over the top, well, I might not be able to get away with it. But when I have nothing invested in here but a single big blind, and suddenly this guy who's been so quiet the whole time is shoving all in, those pocket fours tend to shrink up a bit. Now, heads up, pocket fours might be a really strong hand. But at the same time, I have to think, what is my opponent likely sitting on there? Well, it's very likely something that pocket fours is at least temporarily ahead of. He could have had ace-king, ace-queen, ace-jack, a number of things like that. But he also could have had a pocket pair, and if it was a pocket pair, it was going to be higher than mine. But also I'm looking at the metagame at that point. We haven't even played a single hand heads up yet. This guy's got a really tight table image. I don't want to leave the tournament up to a coin flip, because if he wins there, I've doubled him up and suddenly he's got the chip lead and now I'm the one struggling. So I wound up folding him and letting it go. Now from that point on, we actually had a very good heads-up match. I think it lasted a good 40, 45 minutes, something like that. We went back and forth and back and forth. It was a great matchup. But it was really notable to me that he was the first one who took the aggressive stance. He told me right off the bat, I know I'm behind here, but I am willing to gamble, and I'm going to be super aggressive. And it tempered my play. It made me extra hyper-vigilant about how I was raising and which spots I chose to be aggressive in, because he sent a message right off the bat, I might just go all in on you at a drop of a hat. Now, as it turns out, the chip lead went back and forth many, many times. Either one of us could have won that tournament. I give him big props because he is the one who wound up winning the tournament. But it was when we finally got fairly even in chips and both of us woke up with a really strong hand, and he came from behind to take it from me. And, I'm not at all upset about it because it was a great heads-up play. It wasn't one of those moments where I felt like I had done something wrong, heads up. Some people argue, well, I should have called with the fours there, but I don't regret that because I wanted to be the one in control of the action. It's one thing if I'm the one pushing on him. It's another thing to call in that situation. And there have often been times when I felt maybe I should have called there. Maybe I should have just taken my chances. Who knows? I might have just won the tournament right then and there. But I have no regrets. He knew what he was doing. And over the course of the next 40 or 45 minutes, I proved that I knew what I was doing as well. And since having taken the time to really study heads up and treat it like a different game, to treat it like something that requires a different skill set, I've noticed that I don't come in second place quite as often as I used to. Now, when I'm heads up, I tend to win more often than I don't. I think there's a larger discussion to be had about it, but I think proactive is the word that I really want to stress as far as heads up play is concerned. Be proactive. Control your fate. Maybe do a little bit of daydreaming. Fantasize about you being the one with all the chips in the room. And then you can set about making it happen. I'm your poker guru, Steve Wannall, and if you like what you hear, give me a few likes, subscribe, leave a few comments. I want to hear some of your heads-up philosophies, maybe some of your heads-up stories. And wherever you currently are in your poker journey, I hope that one day you find yourself heads up in a big, huge tournament, and you have what it takes to make sure that you're the one standing at the top of the hill. This has been the Tavern Poker Podcast. Thanks for listening.